Okay, in this tutorial I want to start looking at setting up the Spring container. Now if we look at the diagram again, we can see that the Spring container is dependent on the configuration metadata. Now in this part 1 of the course, our configuration metadata is going to be in XML format and stored in an external file. So if we go across to Eclipse now, we can have our first attempt at creating some Spring configuration metadata in XML format. In part 2 of the course, we'll look at 2 other types of configuration. Don't forget, the Spring container itself is completely decoupled from the configuration metadata itself. Okay, so now we're back into Spring Tool Suite. Let's head over to our Spring Sample 1 initial project and open that up. Now previously we've been looking and working within the source main Java folder. This is mainly because we're using Maven and I'm following the standard Maven directory layout. We're going to start looking at this folder under source main resources because the configuration metadata is going to be held in an XML file, and it's the Maven convention that resources like XML files and properties files are resources and should be held within the resources folder. Now there's one other point here, is that if you're working on a project you may have more than one configuration file for different types of framework you're using. So what I like to do is separate them out, and I do that by creating a folder. So if you do a right click new and then go down to folder, we can create a folder for Spring. Hit finish. So what we've done now, we've created a specific folder here for Spring. Now we need to think about how do we actually create the configuration metadata for our Spring project. Well, within Spring Tool Suite we're quite lucky. If you do a right click here and then new, and then you can scroll down the selections here to Spring Bean configuration file. I mean really this is just a fancy name for the configuration metadata. So let's select that and give it a name. You can have any name you like, but some conventions use word application because it's the configuration for the Spring application, and followed by an XML at the end. Let's do a next rather than finish. And here we've got the namespaces. Now these namespaces are all Spring specific and for the various components you can use within Spring. The one we're interested in at the moment is the one called beans. Don't worry about the term beans at the moment. I'm going to explain that in the next couple of minutes. So let's select that. And once we've selected the namespace, we can also select a XML schema that will validate against. And since we're using Spring 4 at the moment, it makes sense to use the latest schema, 4.0. So let's select that. And we can hit the finish now. And what that's done is basically created a application.xml file, and it's included the namespace for the beans, and also it's included the root element, which is beans. So the question is, what are beans? The objects that form the backbone of your application and which are managed by the Spring container are called beans. A bean is an object that is instantiated, assembled, and otherwise managed through the Spring lifecycle within the container. Okay, so let's have a go at creating some beans for our project. Now let's think about what beans do we need to create. So let's go up to the source main Java and open that up, and head over to the services package, because it's the services that we want managed by the Spring container. First of all, let's look at this implementation class. We want to create an instance of one of these guys. So let's keep things simple for now and go for a basic message of the day implementation. Let's create an instance of that. So how do we do it? The beans is the top level root element within this XML file. So everything we do now, XML wise, goes within this element. Now within Spring Tool Suite, we can do a control space, and that should bring up a list of all the possible elements we can add within the beans element. So let's try that. Let's do control space. And the second one down is bean. That's just what we need. So let's create a bean. Add that element there. And then rather than adding between the actual element tags here, we can add an attribute. So if we do a control space again, it comes up with a list of all the attributes that a bean can have. And the first one we want to do is to actually give some sort of identifier to the instance of this bean. So let's add that, and we can call it something like, it can be any name you want, basic message of day. So that's the ID we're going to give the object that's created here, or I should say bean. And then we can add another attribute here, which is do control space again, which is class. Now this identifies the class that we actually want Spring to instantiate or to create an instance of. Select that. Now you have to put in the fully qualified class name. For example, that means we can't just enter basic message of the day impl. We need to do com.denofprogramming.service and then the class name. Otherwise Spring won't be able to resolve it. Luckily within Spring Tool Suite we can use some autocomplete. So if we just do com dot, and then we can do control space. And just like you would do within your code within Eclipse or Spring Tool Suite, you can then traverse to the various packages you want to look at. And in our case here, we want to go to com.denofprogramming.service. So let's select that. And then we do another dot, and then control space again. And this brings up all the valid classes that we can use in this context. And we want the basic message of the day impl. So let's select that. Now because we're not going to put anything between the element tags of a bean, we can just put a / here at the end of this greater than sign and save that. We've set up our first bean and it has a name or an identifier of basic message of the day, and it's going to be an instance of this class basic message of the day impl. And just to reiterate, this bean is contained within the element of beans, and it's validated against the Spring for Beans XSD. It's not much use on its own, so what do we need to create now? Well, the next thing within our project or application is this message printer. So we need to create an instance of the message printer. All we need to do is create another bean, control space, scroll down to bean. Again, we go into the first bean element here and add an attribute, and we can give that an ID. So the name we can give that is printer, for example. And then we need to tell Spring which class to use. So we add the class attribute, and again we put in the com and then a dot. And then we can use autocomplete to help us. So control space again. Scroll down to com.denofprogramming.service, another dot, another control space, and then we can call up our message printer. And that's great. So what we've done is that we've got two beans within our application configured. But I'm going to do Control S first to save this. We've got two instances being created by Spring. First one is the message printer, and then the basic message of the day implementation for that to use. But there's one thing missing, is that how does this message printer know about that implementation? What we need to do is find a way to actually wire these two together. In fact, that's what it's actually called, is wiring. And there are two ways of doing this, but for now we're going to use the first basic method, which is to do it manually. And the way it's done within Spring is that within the bean element we can add another element. So let's do control space, see what pops up. And if we scroll down to property, so this is telling Spring that we want to set a property on the new instance of this message printer. So let's select property, and we need to give that property a name. Now this is interesting because what Spring will do is when you give this a name and at time of creation of the message printer, it will use reflection to look at this class, and it will use reflection to look for a setter method. And the convention that Spring uses is that it's the name of the setter method minus the set. So in other words, it will be service, only with a lowercase s. So if I could show you that as an example, it's just going to be all lowercase service. And within Spring Tool Suite, it actually validates against that at edit time as well. So I'll go into that a bit more later. And then we can put in a space, and then we do control space again. It comes up with two attributes we can add. We can add either a ref or a value. Now I'll go into a bit more detail about that in the next coming tutorials. Basically, a value is just a primitive type Java value, and a ref is a reference to an object. And that's exactly what we want. We want to reference the basic message of the day. So let's go ahead and add that. So what do you put in between these two quotes? And if you do control space again, it comes up with a couple of options. And this is the beauty of using Spring Tool Suite over just using the basic Eclipse version. Now we can just select basic message of the day because it's already been set up. What Spring done now is that it's actually wired the basic message of the day, which it's looked up on this ID, which is an instance of this class, and it's injected it using the setService method on the message printer class or instance of that class. So let's do Control S to save that. A little bit later on I'll show you that Spring Tool Suite is pretty smart. It actually validates this XML using that schema, and it will tell you whether you've made any mistakes. It also cross-references it with the Java code as well. At creation time, we'll instantiate an instance of basic message of the day implementation and give it an ID of basic message of the day. It will then go and create the message printer instance and give it the ID of printer, and at the same time it will inject this instance of basic message of the day into the message printer using the setService method. In the next tutorial I'm going to show you how we can then use our client and the configuration part of our client to get an instance of our newly wired together message printer object.